Well, okay, so hi patrons, because this is just for you really, and I suppose filling in some of the blanks that maybe some YouTubers are quite keen to fill in because they talk more about themselves than I do. And I've never really done that very much on YouTube. I sort of talk about little bits. I'll mention the fact that I'm in the fire service now and again when it's relevant. I've talked occasionally in amongst 500 videos about my sort of upbringing, my father and stuff, but never really say very much. And you really would have to watch sort of hundreds of videos to pick out these little bits. Because I prefer to let the arguments, what I have to say, speak for itself rather than referring it to anything particular to do with me. But nevertheless, I know that some people find that interesting. They like to flesh out the person, would like to know a little bit more. And from my perspective, it's quite interesting to talk about some of that. And part of what is instigated this video from my perspective is that I suppose there's been a little bit of self-reflection on my part because my father's been ill, fairly gravely ill, although he does look like he's going to recover now. He's just turned 80. He has problems with his circulation. He's got a heart condition. He's had several bouts of heart attacks over the years, but he's got scleroderma, he's got diabetes, and he's losing the circulation in his peripheries. And his foot started to rot away, although they seem to have that under some control now. They put some stents in his leg, and they seem to be stalling the process. So I'm hoping that he will make. He's never going to be back to where he was, I don't think, but I think maybe get somewhere. And my father-in-law's just had a triple heart bypass following a heart attack, and with some complications. So that started to make me think about some of these things. And had to spend more family time. Had the chance to enjoy more family time in some ways, but for the wrong reasons, and made me think a little bit about that. And so I just want to talk a little bit about my life. I'm having a drink, by the way. I've recorded a video in this room. It's a blazing hot day. Been recording a video on toxic masculinity, which I'm assuming you will see after this because this won't require any editing. And the sweat was absolutely pouring off me. I've had the door and windows open to let it cool down a little bit in here. So it's a little bit more bearable now. So anyway, what I want to talk about, what I've written down here, because I didn't want to make a sort of script this out, right? I just want to be able to talk kind of from the heart and just tell you a little bit, obviously not without any sort of doxy kind of details. I want to talk about my family history. I'm more going to talk about my father's side than my mother's side, not because I don't love my mother, not because she wasn't a wonderful mother, is a wonderful mother. She's still alive and doing better than my father. In fact, she said the other day on the phone that she's starting to see herself more as a carer, less as a wife, which is a sad state of affairs. Again, hopefully something that's maybe she's preempting that and he's going to get a little bit more back on his feet now. But that's just a sign of old age and how things can go, doesn't it? But she's been a wonderful mother, but she's had much, much less impact on me in terms of my beliefs and my interest in science and religion and politics. I mean, the conversations that I've had with my father over religion and does God exist and all this kind of thing. And honestly, I couldn't even tell you. If you asked me, does my mother believe in a God? I could tell you that I'm sure she's not a Christian, but does she believe in a God? Does she believe the universe has a creator? I honestly couldn't tell you what she believes. I've just, they're not conversations that I've ever had with her. So I'm going to talk a lot less about my mother and my mother's side of the family than my father's side. Because I think it's more interesting, my father's side, with regard to that. So, a little bit of family history. I come from actually quite a wealthy family. Not so you'd know. The money had long since dried up before I was born. What happened was our family is from Grimsby, which is At the time, if you went back to the sort of 1920s, was the biggest fish docks in the world, landed more fish than anywhere else. And our family owned the largest fish curing house in Grimsby, smoking fish, which was big business back then. And so there was quite a lot of wealth in the family, and indeed we were one of the first families in the town to own a motor car. It was my great-grandfather's business. My grandfather, his son, bought his house. His father bought his house, as he did for quite a number of relatives. He just bought them a house. And there was quite a bit of money to go round in those days. But my grandfather, my father's father, was an alcoholic. He had fought in the Somme, and he'd never come back to be the same guy, I think, that went away. Although who knows what would have happened without that, because of course he went away as a young man. I don't know exactly how old, but let's say 20 years old. I'm just trying to work the ages out, because I think he was a couple of years older than my grandmother. My grandmother had my father when she was 42, I think, which was kind of interesting, because when we had our little boy, my wife was 42, a couple of years back now, that is. He's 2 years and 4 or 5 months now. And 5 months. And the odds that they gave us, we had IVF, but the odds that they gave us without IVF were really, really small. And then to think that actually my grandmother was in her 40s when she had my father, and how small those odds were, but that was when she had him without obviously any IVF in those days, was kind of interesting. But from the point when my father was born, his father, my grandfather, was pretty much, from what I understand, neither use nor ornament. He would work some days for his father, but he spent most of his time gambling and getting drunk. He was a proper alcoholic, and drunk meths if there was no alcohol available. And that was ultimately, he died. He died, but he was quite interesting, mirrored on both sides of my family. My great uncle on my mother's side and my father on my dad's side both worked on the docks, and it was a competition between whether sclerosis of the liver would kill them, liver failure would kill them, or whether cancer would kill them, because they both had both of these things at the same time, and they were both dying of both of these things at the same time. So my father was brought up, I think, largely by his mother, and he's an interesting guy, my dad. He had an interest in marine biology and would spend a lot of time in Cleethorpes on the beach, because Cleethorpes is one of these places. It's a seaside resort that isn't actually on the seaside, right? The sea doesn't bank onto the sea. It banks on, if you look at a map, onto the mouth of the Humber Estuary. And the Humber Estuary is really interesting. Ecologically, it is, I believe, a part of it as you go towards Immingham, a site of international significance for seabird colonies, and there's a lot of marine biology out there. There's a small area of sand, which is the beach, but then there are these huge mud flats there, which you'd expect at the mouth of an estuary, right? And so he spent a lot of time out there, including time when he should have been at school. He got selected for the grammar school, but then he had Weil's disease, rat bite fever as they called it back in the day. He was off school. He was in hospital for the best part, I believe, of 9 months, and could well have died at that, and ended up going a year back at school and never really picked that back up properly again. But he was interested in marine biology, he was interested in science, and he started to tutor himself at that. When he moved in, he was very much at this stage, the family had gone, the wealth had all gone, and he went to work in factories on the Humber Bank, which was a growing local industry at the time, and that influenced a lot of things. It started to influence his politics, which I'll mention, but it also meant that he then developed his own interests in science. And so when I came on the scene, I'm about 10 years older than my two sisters. They were born when my mother was 20 odd years old, about 20 years old, I think. And I was born when she was in her early 30s, because like I said, I'm about 11 and 12 years older than my sisters. And when I came on the scene, he had quite an interest in science, and he's developed that interest, I think, kind of cut it from fresh cloth. Now, I don't know enough about my grandfather. I suppose I could still ask my dad. This is still something I could find out about. But I don't know whether he passed any of that on, or whether he's responsible for that, really. The only thing I know really about my grandfather is he took my father on one trip, which was to the Blue John mines in Derbyshire. So maybe he had some interest in geology himself, in amongst all the alcoholism and the gambling. But my father's had a big interest in that. He's gone away to conferences on ice ages and glaciation in the past. He's not an expert in these fields, but he has a lay expertise in these things, and he's well read. He's quite well read in popular science and stuff like that. And so something that I often has been, I suppose that is something that has I've become kind of synonymous, I suppose, on YouTube, is the way that I approach things rather than what I believe. And yet, to me, although that might stand out as being a little bit out of the norm on YouTube, because YouTube tends to be very political in the way people approach things, doesn't it? People approach things the way they approach a debate, because the way that politics functions and the way that a debate functions is that it's win or lose. And you promote your arguments, and you give no quarter to the strongest arguments of the opposition. That's the kind of way it works, isn't it? And that's very, very alien to me. And that's not really because it might be that there's something intrinsic in me, but that's very much the way that my father brought me up to deal with these things. He was interested in whether or not God existed, and one thing that he said to me, we had these discussions from a very young age. In fact, he says that I was 6 years old when I told him that I didn't believe that God existed. And then I gave him my reasons why. And that actually, he says those reasons, he can't remember exactly what I said, but it was a reasonably cogent, better than you would expect for a 6-year-old. But he, as in a lot of people did of his generation, regarded himself as an agnostic, even though looking at what he believes, and being agnostic, I mean, not in the more sophisticated sense as relating to knowledge rather than belief, but as sitting in the middle of believing in God and being an atheist. Because that's a position that a lot of people took there. They saw atheism as a very, very hard line position. But one thing about him is that he very much adopted a devil's advocate position, so that when I would come to him with arguments against religion, even though really his position, and I think he calls himself an atheist now, maybe as much as anything from conversations that he's had with me, really, I've influenced him as I've got older. But he would very much play the devil's advocate, and whatever I was arguing for, he'd give me the counters, or the best that he could, he'd give me the counters for it. And even if he didn't believe those arguments, he'd give me the kind of arguments that other people would be making. And so that became the norm to me. It very much became the norm. I was brought up in an environment which was that when you considered anything, even if you had a position on it, you really properly went and looked for the best arguments of the opposition, and that you entertained them and you saw whether there was some value in them. And that wasn't just some kind of window dressing, but that was just the normal kind of way of doing things. And so it kind of seems odd for me, starting my experience on YouTube 10 years ago, finding that how rare that was, really, that people tended to adopt a much more zealous approach based on zealotry, based on just finding the strongest arguments for your position and just promoting those arguments rather than looking at it in a more holistic approach. But he did very much. He had an influence on my atheism and on the positions that I have, but also on the way I'm saying that I structured the way that I looked at things, that the approach that I took to things. And he taught me a lot about science from quite a young age. You know, he gave me books. He'd read books on relativity and quantum mechanics. He's not a very good mathematician, my dad, and he'd struggle with that. But he's a bright guy, and he understood some of the or he understood as well as you can. I mean, these are mind-boggling concepts for anybody, and I've kind of enjoyed struggling with some of the concepts of conceptualizing relativity and quantum mechanics as I've grown up. And when I've found read things that have helped me to gain a mental image, a mental map, a mental model of these things, I've enjoyed going back and reliving those discussions with my father, really, as the years have rolled on, to maybe enable him to revisit those things and understand them better. But, you know, he gave me books to read on relativity, and probably at about the age 11, and maybe quantum mechanics at about the age 13. So I was growing up with these ideas, and my mind was boggled at them as a young teenager, which was really, really interesting. And so that had quite an impact upon me, really, and that's developed those kind of lifelong interests with regard to them. I think something that's been pardon me, not fundamental to my YouTube work, but which has crept in to a few videos in recent past, has been politics and my kind of centrist position, but maybe a right of centre position on economic politics generally, a left of centre position on social politics. And it's interesting to factor where they come in with relation to my father, and in relation to my family, actually, because with some of the politics that have taken place recently, with regard to the whole Brexit thing, I voted Remain. I was a kind of soft Remain. We've voted as a country for Brexit, and I can live with that. We need to make the best of it. But I voted Remain. My father voted Remain. All the rest of my family were ardent Leavers, which is kind of interesting. But I would say on most social issues, most of my family are quite right-wing compared to me. I'm much more sort of socially tolerant and progressive than they are, including my father. I mean, the kind of environment that I grew in with relation to things like homosexuality and gay rights, that kind of thing, that's the kind of one that immediately springs to mind, would be much more conservative than the positions that I have now. And those are certainly issues that I've revised my opinions on over the years. So I've not really inherited my father's positions on those or my mother's positions on those, although maybe the modes of thinking, the way that arriving at a position, I've got from them. And maybe being a bit younger, as those issues have changed throughout society, and as information has been gathered and permeated, diffused throughout society with regard to those issues, I've been able to change more than they have, purely by dint of being younger. Because I do think we have this problem of demonising old people now, effectively for growing up in the era in which they grew up in, which I think we need to cut them a little bit more slack than certain groups do. But with regard to politics, I was thinking more in relation to economic politics. What I gained from it was this, which was that my father was very much in a unionised business, right? He worked in Immingham for big industrialised groups, and this is growing up at the end of the 70s, the start of the 80s, when really, well, in the 70s, I was a little bit too young to remember this, but at the end of the 70s, economically, the country had gone to the fucking dogs. Inflation was high. We had a 3-day working week. There were general strikes. The winter of discontent. The United Kingdom was forced to take the largest loan from the IMF that the IMF had ever issued, just to keep the UK economy from sinking into oblivion. The policies of the post-war consensus, the Keynesian economics, stimulus had failed, and actually it was just making, with each economic cycle, it was making things worse. Nationalised industry, well, a large proportion, the academic agent said the other day it was 20% of UK industry, which I was flabbergasted, even I didn't realise it amounted to that much. Nationalised industry was an albatross around our neck. I accept nowadays that there are some arguments to be made for nationalising certain industries. Maybe we've made a misstep in privatising a couple of particular examples, but the idea that having them nationalised is like we're going to make some money from it, that we can recoup the profits, because as soon as you nationalise them, for various reasons, those profits start to dry up. You can't make the business decisions that you needed to make anymore to keep them profitable. You need to start acting in the public interest. This is why when the UK government bought large chunks of the Bank of Scotland and of Lloyd's TSB, they maintained such a hands-off approach. They said, we have nothing to do with the management to these, because they knew if there's any inkling that they're going to have some input, that then you will not be able to pay the large salaries to the chief executives, and decent chief executives will go elsewhere, that these banks will have to be managed in a way which is for the public good, which will probably be catastrophic for the banks. Because that is what happened. We had these absolutely fucking abominably poorly run British industries, I suppose, typified by something like British Leyland, which was just churning out crappy cars at a massive loss and required huge amounts of subsidisation year on year, and just provided. I think you need to accept anything that is privatised, you're effectively funding out of the public purse. And what happened with regard to my father is that I saw as he saw, even though he was a union man, and he taught me the benefit of unions, which I understand to this day, and I'm a firm and ardent supporter of trades unions because they support the individual. You need to act on a collective basis, because a worker alone has very little power. But at the same stage, unions can soon have too much power. Unions are they have the same self-interests as management, and they will drag a company under in the same way as a company will happily drag its employees under, I'm afraid. And back in the day, the unions had way too much power. And my father, even though he was a union man, a member of unions and believed in unions, he saw what unions were doing to this country at the time, and that the governments that were involved seemed powerless to do anything about it. There wasn't the political will to tackle the unions. And of course, this is what the winter of discontent came over. One of the things was that the unions were being offered a 5%. I mean, look at it in modern terms. They were being offered a 5% pay rise. That wasn't good enough as far as they were concerned. And even though the country could ill afford a fucking 5% pay rise, we were in an economically powerless state. They were still prepared to bring the country to its absolute knees because they wanted more of the same. And so I think that kind of set me up politically to fear that kind of approach. And so when Margaret Thatcher appeared on the screen, appeared on the scene, and in many ways was vilified throughout her prime ministership, her leadership period, often for very good reason. She was a cold and heartless bitch in many ways. Some of the things that she did, such as taking on the unions, such as some of the changes that she made, reducing the tax rates from 70 and 80% down to the kind of rates that we see now, such as privatising large chunks of industry, such as freeing up some of the regulation and allowing the marketplace to make some money, not on the grounds necessarily of trickle-down economics, that money filters down to us, but the ground that a healthy economy allows more tax revenue to be gained in the end, even at smaller tax rates, which allows us to afford and fund the good stuff, the welfare state that we all enjoy as it is. If your economy is sick, then you can't raise the revenues. Well, you can raise the revenues, but only by further crippling that economy and driving it further and further into the red. So I appreciated that. And in many ways, I fear that we're bringing into generations now that didn't experience just how bad things were then, and just see the wonderful claims of that if we spend money on A, B, C, D, E and F, everything's going to be great. Let's just spend money on all these things and don't see the need to be able to afford to spend those things, and how things can turn out if you don't balance things totally. I'll be honest, in some ways I think that's made me a little bit too economically conservative, and this is something I'm trying to reevaluate now as somebody who has been very much in favour of austerity, even though it's cost me a small fortune. In terms of my pension alone, the pension changes will have cost me around £200,000, which is about $270,000, because I work in the public sector. I've had to put up with 1% or 0% pay rises since 2008. My wife works in the public sector. She's a teacher. I would assume her pension losses will be similar to my pension losses. So again, you're talking about another £200,000. So it's lost us knocking on for about $500,000 there, has the austerity thing. But I can recognise the need for some of those things with an ageing population, with the increasing expenses that incurs. It's a big pill to swallow personally, but I can see why these things have needed to happen in actual fact. But maybe I've got a little bit too locked into that, a little bit too fearful of economic stimulus, and maybe the balance has been a little bit wrong. It'll be interesting to see where governments go from that. So maybe that ties my politics. I hope that ties my politics, my perspective on religion and how I tackled that, and my perspective on science into some of my family history. One other thing that I will talk about is how I started on YouTube with regard to that. Because as I grew up, I went away to university. I did a degree, a mechanical engineering degree. It was actually in acoustic engineering and vibration at the University of Southampton, if you're interested. Looking back on that, I wish that isn't something that I'd done. I wish I'd done physics or biology. I wish I'd done a pure science. I'm not somebody who's regretful. I don't look back on my life and think I should have done that differently, I should have done that differently in terms of dwelling on that. I'm happy with how my life's panned out. Right. I have my health, I have a wonderful boy, wonderful wife. I'm not wealthy, but I've got enough to sort of enjoy my life generally. And with the money actually that I get through Patreon, it's allowed my wife to reduce to 4 days a week to enjoy a little bit more time with our baby boy, and yet we can still pay the bills, including the £200,000 mortgage that we have hanging over our heads. We can still manage to do that. So that's absolutely great. So there's no regret with regard to that. But just looking back, if all this was to dematerialise now and I had to go back to university, I would probably do biology because I think that's such a fascinating subject, or physics. The only thing that puts me off physics is that I think that physics has got tied up a little bit much now. Fascinating subject that it is, it doesn't seem to be making very much progress. The whole string theory, superstring theory position doesn't seem to be going very far. Decade on decade seems to be going by now, and not a lot of progress seems to be made. Tens of thousands of papers are written on this stuff, and not one falsifiable prediction has been made yet. So that seems to be going into a bit of a dead end at the moment, which is perhaps why biology, with the benefit of hindsight, would be a more interesting thing to go into. But I didn't. I went into engineering, and I have to admit I don't have very much interest in that. And I finished at university at a time when it was in a recession, and a time when there was a lot of people who had 10, 20, 30 years in engineering had lost their jobs. And they were the obvious people to employ. And of course, in times of recession, the number of graduate opportunities diminish as well, right? Why are you going to spend a couple of years funding graduate programs? You'll fill the posts that you can fill with experienced people, A, because all these experienced people are now available, and 2, because you've got less posts to fill because the economy is contracting and not expanding. So it wasn't a good time for getting jobs, and so I was also engaged at the time. So I ended up staying down in Southampton where I've been studying and working in Habitat, the furniture store, in their warehouse, running the warehouse side of the store, in actual fact. And then when that finished, because I broke up with the girl I was engaged to, I moved back home and ended up on unemployment benefit and looking for a job. And although I was mainly looking for graduate positions, I knew somebody who worked in the fire service. They said that they were employing. I'd never considered it. It was the kind of thing I'd never have considered in a million years, to be honest. But I went and spoke to him about it, and I thought, this is not the kind of thing I ever envisaged that I would do. But it sounded kind of an enjoyable lifestyle. And it became more of a lifestyle choice rather than an intellectual choice. So things kind of changed in my life from there, because after I took a couple of applications to get in, but I got in, despite the fact on each occasion you had about 2,000 applicants for about 20 positions. Despite the fact the first time that I applied, the fact that I was a graduate clearly stood against me at the interview stage. When I got through to that stage, they made that quite clear. It was a very different process the second time. And they seemed a lot more welcoming. It was different people interviewing. It was less hostile. It wasn't an over-the-table interview. Even though this was only like 3 months later, it was much more put you at ease, 2 chairs next to one another, let's get the most out of you. Very, very strange. Very, very strange. Same employer, totally different approach. And I got in. But that was a watershed moment in my life, because it meant that the sort of intellectual side was no longer being stimulated by work or by education. And I did a few things, I tried to, something I'd thought about for a few years was to try and get into Mensa, and I applied for Mensa, and then you have to go away and you sit the exams. It was about 40 miles I had to travel, and you sit the exams. I passed the exams to get into Mensa quite easily on one of the exams. It worked out. You need to get at the sort of 1 in 50 level to get in, and I was at about the 1 in 250 level. And then you're a member of Mensa, and you get these magazines and shit through, and you realise what a bunch of boring wankers. I'm sorry if there's anybody who's a member of Mensa, but the local branch, what a bunch of boring cunts they appeared to be. So I never actually went to anything and cancelled my membership after a couple of years of doing that. But I started to read more about these things that I was interested in, but I wasn't engaging with people. And then it was maybe a few years later, a lot of people will say they came to atheism with Richard Dawkins and the God Delusion. I certainly didn't. I was already aware of Richard Dawkins. He was somebody that when I was young, going back to my father had sort of warned me about him somewhat and said, this is a really interesting guy. He was doing, I think, some of the Christmas lectures. There was a series of Christmas lectures at the Royal Society that are televised, and he was doing them on evolution. He said, this is a really interesting guy, this Richard Dawkins, but he has some very strident views on things, and you need to sort of take that into account. He's very much not up for debate, certain things with him, including his views on religion and stuff. This was years before the God Delusion. And these were things that I was interested in all the way through. I was aware of Richard Dawkins, so I was aware of what his positions were, and I'd read some of him, and I'd seen some of his, I'd seen him giving lectures and then presenting episodes of Horizon, which is a popular science program on the UK. Worth searching out, actually. If you put in Horizon, BBC, Richard Dawkins, there's a couple of really interesting, very old episodes of Horizon with him on. Worth checking out those. You get them on YouTube. But I was aware of that. And then what had happened, the God Delusion still played an important part for me, because what had happened was I'd just gone to visit my dad. And he'd said to me, have you seen Richard Dawkins has got a book on called The God Delusion? He said he was on Newsnight the other day talking to Jeremy Paxman about it. So I thought, well, that's kind of interesting because I know Richard Dawkins' position, but now he's gone and written a book on it. And so I ended up watching it and thinking, you know what, I'll buy the book. So I bought the book, and as a result of that, I went onto YouTube. And I actually went on YouTube to try and find some information about a couple of things that I was reading in the book. And I ended up starting to realize that there were conversations taking place, aside from the God delusion, about things that I'd been thinking about for a long time, to do with religion, to do with evolutionary biology, etc., etc. And so I thought, okay, I need to comment on some of these. So I started commenting, and one thing led to another, and there was a ginger-haired guy, I don't know what he was called, this Christian guy, and I'd responded to a couple of videos that he made with comments, and then eventually he'd made one, and I thought, you know, I want to respond to this. And I knew I had a webcam. When I'd bought my computer years beforehand, I'd got a free webcam. I'd never even set it up, but I started rooting around in the drawer to find and set this webcam up, and that was how I started making videos. And so in many ways it was the God delusion, not the content of the God delusion, but the fact that the God delusion had got me to look on YouTube, and then I'd uncovered all this thing that had been going on, and found what a wonderful, wonderful set of conversations that were taking place. And that was what got me started on YouTube. And then as that progressed, I got involved more and more with regard to that. And what a wonderful experience that became for me. I can say that I know I have grown in terms of my knowledge and in terms of my understanding, and also the ways that I approach things has changed. I talked earlier on in this about getting the fundamentals of that from my father, but also the interactions that I've had have influenced that whilst being on YouTube as well. And although some of the issues have changed, some of those fundamentals haven't. And of course then you start to draw parallels between the conversations that you're having now and the conversations that you're having then. But it was a wonderful journey for me, and it also brought me more into philosophy, because one thing that my father wasn't really very schooled in at all, he was interested in science, he was interested in religion, but out of the sphere of religion and how philosophy particularly pertains to religion, discussions of a philosophical nature were few and far between, or very uninformed. We may have discussed morality and what morality means, what it comes from, what do we mean when we make moral statements. But we wouldn't have even used that term. I wouldn't have even said to my father, well, what does it mean when we make a moral statement? We just kind of have a discussion on right and wrong and what it's based on, you know. So as I got onto YouTube, there was a lot of people that were very much into philosophy from different perspectives, and so you start to bring that on, and that's been a wonderful learning journey for me over 9 years now. 9 years of learning about and reading about these things as a result also of the interactions that I've had on YouTube. I don't know whether I'm just trying to think whether there's anything else that I want to include with this video. Maybe I should just tell you a little bit about my circumstances now, perhaps. Well, on YouTube, I suppose, what morphed into what happened now is that I was very much just a YouTube atheist, and I was very much a kind of bionic dance kind of character, in that I just talked about that subject. I very, very rarely went beyond that, even though outside of YouTube I talk about a great number of things and I had a great number of other interests. But I didn't talk about those on YouTube. But then the Atheism Plus thing happened, and the Free Thought Blogs thing happened, which I've discussed at length in the past. And what happened is that these things all became linked together in a kind of entryist way, that people got involved in the atheist community that weren't really that interested in it, actually. They were more interested in their socio-political agenda, and it's seemingly they wanted to make atheist movements in America about these other things. I think this is one of the bad points about intersectionality. It's not just that you're sensitive of the way that these different things interact. It's that you end up making everything about everything, and you end up making everything about the bit that you're interested in, rather than shelving the bit that you're interested in and saying, well, what is this about, right? It's about going into a skeptic society as somebody famously, Natalie Miller, I think she was called, I think that was her name, Natalie something, Natalie, well, it's Natalie something or other on Free Thought blogs. She said she went into these skeptics movements, and they were interested in things like Bigfoot and UFOs and things that she wasn't interested in. And she thought, that's not my skepticism. My skepticism is not about silly things. This is what she said, silly things that have already been debunked like that. My skepticism is about women's rights and about feminism and about equality, and I wanted the movement to be about these things. And you can't help but thinking, well, why did you go into these fucking skeptic societies in the first place? It's like me going into a tennis club and saying, well, really, I'm interested in golf. What the fuck are you all playing tennis for? Let's all start playing golf. Fuck off into a tennis club if what you want to... So fuck off into a golf club if you're interested in playing golf. Don't go in a tennis club and tell them all they need to start playing golf. But seemingly these people don't understand that, right? That if what they're about is A, then everybody's fucking concern should be A. And so you end up with this entryist approach where they go into other groups and try and make those groups about what they're interested in. And the end result with that was that I ended up, yeah, that's the irony of it, I ended up being interested and talking about the things that they were interested in. What I wasn't aware of the time is that this was happening elsewhere as well. I was just seeing a microcosm of this. And so I've ended up shifting into these other subjects as well. I still try and keep the YouTube atheism thing alive. I still enjoy that, and I kind of wish that things would swing back a bit more into that, because that is still my first love as well. And I try and do one video on that every month, on the sort of atheist religion great debate thing. But that's how things got shifted across there. But I just try and apply the same reasoning there as I do with everything else. Why should the method of thinking change just because you're talking about another subject? Although I'm afraid that people tend to have this emotional position where there are some subjects that they just get emotional about, right? And the method of thinking that holds, that they regard as reasonable in everything else, they suddenly shelve. And that can happen with regard to gender politics or socio-politics. For other people, actually, religion is the subject, where suddenly faith is a legitimate, I'm a scientist the rest of the time, but when I talk about religion, I don't need to be rational, right? I can be emotional. I can just go on faith rather than what I see before me. I can just trust in God and trust that God exists rather than relying on balance of evidence. That is just such an alien way of thinking to me, to be like that. So that's kind of what got me to where I am on YouTube today. Where I am in my life today, I think most of you know a little bit about that, which is that I'm working the fire service, in a fire service, and I've got 22 years in that. I should have been retiring in 8 years. I'll now be retiring in 15 years thanks to the pension changes. There'll be another 5 years of working for my money. It'll be another 5 years of not getting, at today's rate, £20,000 a year in pension, and a reduction in the lump sum that I would have been getting also as a result of that. But that's fine, as long as my health holds up for those extra years and I don't get penalised for not managing. My knees go or something in those intervening years. I'll probably feel a little bit sour if that happens. But otherwise, that's a position with regard to that. I live in a rural part of the country. I'll try and explain for those of you that don't know where I live. I live in Lincolnshire. You can look it up on the map. It's on the east coast of the United Kingdom, in a town called Louth, which is a market town on the edge of the Lincolnshire Wolds, a population of about 16 or 17,000. A very, very conservative place. I think about 75 or 80% Conservative voters, about 20% Labour voters in the last election. Very, very rural, very conservative in its thinking in that respect. Not particularly religious. I think most people from if you're American, you will regard being conservative being very religious. It doesn't function in that way in the UK. Religion is hardly ever talked about. It's not like there's floods of people going to church and big placards saying praise God. Religion is almost never discussed. In fact, you're as more likely probably to hear people discussing religion in some of the left-wing Labour strongholds, where you get a lot of immigrant communities which are much more religion oriented, the Caribbean communities, the African communities, the Eastern European communities, much more religious communities. And those inner city working class communities tend to be left-wing hotspots. In the country, it's not that it's rich, right? I live in one of the most poor parts of the country, but in the UK, in these rural areas, it tends to be quite right-wing. Yet I work in Grimsby, which is 20 miles less than 20 miles down the road. And Grimsby, you could put a rosette on a fucking pig, right? A red rosette on a pig, and they'd vote for it. That is Labour to its core. So that's really, really interesting. And it means that a lot of the people that I work for are Labour voters. The vast majority, I think on the watch that I worked on at the last election, there was only me and one other that voted for Conservative at this election. If you want to know why, I made a video the other day. But to be honest, it was as much about the top team of Corbyn, McDonnell and Abbott as it was about policies, to be fair. I was more than happy. I fell over myself to vote for Blair, Brown and Straw. I thought they were an absolutely immense team, and their politics was about where my politics was, to be honest. But Corbyn, McDonnell and Abbott really is something a little bit beyond. Get a little bit of a nosebleed at that point. But the majority, all but two of us on the watch I work on, voted Labour, and was quite happy to admit that. Interestingly enough, when it came to Brexit, I voted Remain, and I think there was certainly only one other person on the watch who was vocally Remain. The overwhelming response on the watch was Leave. So the position, it's regarded as sort of the Tory UKIP right-wing position as being stronger on the Leave camp, and yet I kind of work with people who constitute the sort of Labour heartland that are nevertheless very Eurosceptic and very anti-immigration there. So that's kind of interesting with regard to that. So I kind of see both sides of that. I live in an environment which is very, very white, not because of racism, but just because I think most people who migrate to the UK, you're not going to think, oh, I know, I'll go and live in this fucking small market town in the middle of nowhere that I've never heard of. No, you're going to think I'll go and live in Birmingham, Manchester, London, I think, where you think the work's going to be and where other people from your culture are going to be living. That's pretty much all that's about. But I'm living in this very much sort of Tory blue place, but then working and was born in very much this left-wing place. I get to see kind of both sides of that, and my politics very much straddles both sides of that. Okay, I don't know. I've talked for 48 minutes now. This video wasn't asked for by patrons, but I just thought it would flesh out a little bit more about me. And I suppose there's one other thing that I ought to say, just in case you're not aware, and just in case you're still watching at this point. About my family life. So my wife's about the same age as I am. She works as a teacher. She has a more senior role than I have, actually. It's kind of an interesting thing with regard to the wage gap, which was that when we met, she earned about 1.5 times what I earn. And with the birth of our son, she wanted to reduce our work. She was adamant she was going to reduce our working hours because she wanted to spend more time with him. And I understand that. Working a 9 to 5 would mean she'd only have 2 daytimes a week. Whereas for me, working shifts, I get to spend more daytimes with our little boy. under normal circumstances anyway. So it meant that I'd have to pick up some of the slack, which is where Patreon kicked in, where that became a necessity for me, that if I couldn't do it through Patreon, the videos would have to stop. I'd have to do something else. But the interesting thing, the ironic thing as a result of that, is that because our baby boy's been born, as a result of me doing everything that I can to give her the choice to reduce her working week and go down to 4 days a week, I now earn more than she earns. So this is the irony, which is in terms of the wage gap in the UK, we are a problem. We are part of the oppression of women. We are part of what is suppressing women's wages in the UK. And yet that is as a result of us doing, between the two of us, with our own free will and acting in her interests more than mine, doing everything we can to enable her to spend more time with her son. So I kind of find that ironic now. So yeah, I earn a little bit more than she earns now because she's reduced what she earns and I've increased what I earn. But she's a teacher. Ironically, the subject that she taught for a great number of years, she's trained as a geography and history teacher. She's got a joint honours degree in history and geography. But for quite a number of years, she was head of department for religious education. She always taught it from a kind of ethics and morals perspective rather than teaching the Bible and all that lot. She would teach a comparative religion. Let's take a subject, euthanasia or abortion or something like that. Discuss the issues and then discuss how different religions would look at it. But yeah, it's kind of interesting that that for all the videos that I've made on YouTube about religion, my wife was, for most of that time, a head of RE. What's also interesting is when it came to biblical affairs, like setting out the books in the Tanakh in some kind of order, and the history of the sort of Deuteronomic history documents and of the Torah, and of, you know, what happened with relation to with Noah, with Adam and Eve and Noah and Abraham as the first proper patriarch, and Moses and the history, and what do all these things mean, and what are the significance of these characters, and when do they occur in the theological timeline, as well as what is their position in an historical timeline in terms of when are the ideas about them, and what is the historicity of these characters, etc., etc. It will be my wife that comes to me to ask me about these things, even though she's an RE teacher, which we both always found kind of amusing, really. So yeah, that's what we both do now. And we've got a little boy who was born in December 2014. He is a fabulous little lad. He is so clever. For his age, he's 2 years 5 months, and God, he's a clever little sod. The things that he picks up on and the little tricks that he's understood, and his theory of mind now seems to be so developed in terms of understanding not only what you know, but how he can manipulate what you know to get what he wants or to justify what he's done. It's very, very, very impressive. Really, I can't wait for him to be older still and to start to have some of the discussions with him that he had with me. Okay, that's pretty much filled you in on what you need to know, I think. Thank you for watching. 53 minutes, the length of this video. I did tell you that this would be a little bit unstructured and that it would be a kind of meander through what makes me me. As I said in the video that you've not watched, let me get one of these baby wipes to wipe my head down. This video is this room is absolutely stinking hot today on one of the hottest days of the year. I've got the windows shut and the lights on so I can record this. But I hope this has been of some interest for some of you, and it's certainly a video that I can refer people to if they want to know a little bit more about me. And some of these things that I've discussed, it's not doxable material really, but it's not stuff that I would sort of set as a public video. You know, they're not secrets. But they're not stuff that I particularly want to discuss necessarily in a public video. So it's nice for me to have this forum with my patrons where actually I can discuss and flesh out a little bit more about me. So anyway, thanks. I hope this has been of some interest to those that have made it to the end. And another Patreon video upcoming on how I make my videos for Brascafarian. And also another video probably coming up next month that was requested by another patron. But more about that on another occasion. Thank you for watching. Thank you for continued support. Bye for now. Good, I like that sound. Okay.